On the night of January the 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor lay dying at Westminster. He had ruled England for nearly a quarter of a century, pious and careful, but he had never produced an heir. By the next day, January the 6th, Edward was dead, and the crown that had seemed stable suddenly became a prize. In later retellings, Edward's last moments are crowded with meaning. Some sources claim he named Harald Godwinson as his successor on his deathbed. Others hint that the words were uncertain, or that they were shaped by those who stood closest to the dying king. What is clear is this: Edward's death created a legal and political problem that could not be solved by bloodline alone. England did not follow a simple automatic rule of inheritance. The royal house of Wessex mattered, but so did acceptance by the leading men of the kingdom. Kingship still carried an elective element, guided by precedent and power. The Witan, an assembly of senior churchmen and nobles, could recognise a king, and that recognition was the difference between rightful rule and civil breakdown. In 1066, the Witan's choice would be contested, not only by rival English factions, but by ambitious rulers across the sea. Harald Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, stood at the centre of the moment. He was the most powerful noble in England, the son of Earl Godwin, and the leader of a family that had dominated Edward's reign. He also had the practical advantage of being present, with support in London and a network strong enough to move quickly. Within hours of Edward's death, the Witan acknowledged Harold as king, and he was crowned likely the same day with remarkable speed. If you enjoy these long history stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from, your city or country. Harold's rapid elevation solved one problem and created several more. At home, it risked deepening resentments among other great earls, especially in the north where loyalties and rivalries could be as decisive as any foreign army. Harold was experienced, wealthy and battle-tested, but he was not a king by unquestioned dynastic right. His legitimacy would be argued over, and those arguments would soon be sharpened into weapons. Beyond England, Edward's reign had left dangerous ties and expectations. In Normandy, Duke William believed the throne had been promised to him, whether by Edward himself, by earlier understandings, or by later Norman claims is still debated, but William treated it as a binding commitment. Across the North Sea, the Scandinavian world had its own memory of rule in England, and its own calculations about what Edward's death made possible. The English Channel and the cold waters to the north were not barriers, they were roads. So 1066 opened with a kingdom that had a new king, but no peace. Harold would face threats from Normandy and from Scandinavia, while trying to hold together a realm where power was concentrated in a few massive earldoms and where family alliances could shift quickly. This story will follow that year, its marches, battles and hard decisions, and then the years immediately after, as one victory turns into conquest, and conquest into a new order, ending with William's consolidation of England. To understand why Edward's death could unravel the realm so fast, and why Harold's crown was both necessary and vulnerable, we need to look at what Anglo-Saxon England was in the last days before the crisis, how it was governed, where its strength lay, and where the fractures were already waiting. Anglo-Saxon England in 1066 was not a loose tribal land, but a mature kingdom with working institutions, steady revenue, and a political culture that expected consultation. The king sat at the centre, but he did not rule alone. Royal authority moved through networks, through the great men who advised him, through officials who enforced law and collected dues, and through a church that could bless a reign or quietly undermine it. At the top was the Witan, the council of leading nobles and senior churchmen. It was not a parliament in the later sense, but it mattered. The Witan witnessed major decisions, confirmed grants of land, and most crucially in a succession crisis, recognised who would be treated as king. A strong ruler could steer it, but could not easily ignore it, because the realm's most powerful earls and bishops were the ones who made royal orders real in the shires. Below that high politics, England was organised into shires, each with courts and local officers. The sheriff, the king's man in the county, was key, collecting royal revenues, calling local levies, and ensuring that fines and obligations reached the crown. Hundreds, subdivisions of the shire, held regular courts that handled disputes and policing. This local administration gave England an advantage many rivals lacked. The king could reach deep into the countryside, not just through personal charisma, but through routine systems that had been hardened over generations. Yet those same systems depended on cooperation from magnates, and by 166 power had become heavily concentrated in a handful of massive earldoms. An earl was not merely a regional noble. He could be the hinge between the king and entire provinces. The greatest was Wessex, rich and populous, with the old heartlands of the West Saxon royal house and the administrative centre around Winchester. By Edward's final years, Wessex was held by the Godwin family, and its wealth and manpower helped make Harold's swift coronation possible. But it also meant that the crown's stability rested on a family whose interests did not always match the king's, and whose rivals watched for any weakness. Other great earldoms, especially in the north, could behave almost like semi-independent powers. The farther from the royal core, the more local loyalties and regional identities mattered. Northumbria, with its own traditions and its proximity to Scotland and the Scandinavian world, had a different political gravity from the south. When the kingdom was calm, these earldoms could be managed through marriages, appointments, and careful bargaining. In crisis, they could become fault lines. The economy that underpinned all this was overwhelmingly rural and based on landholding. Great estates, held by the king, by earls, by bishops, and by monasteries, produced the food and rents that sustained households and armies. England also had towns, mints, and a developed money economy for the period, with silver pennies struck in many places and regulated closely by royal authority. That mattered because a king who could tax and pay could move faster than one who relied only on personal loyalty. Taxation and obligation were practical, not abstract. The land tax known as the Geld could be raised across the kingdom, originally strengthened in response to Viking threats, and later used by kings as a flexible source of cash. Land was also assessed in hides, a unit tied to fiscal duty as much as acreage. From land came service. Men owed labour, supplies, and, when called, fighting. The state could demand ships and coastal watch in some regions, and it could demand men for the host. But these demands had limits, and 166 would expose them. The church was the other great pillar. Bishops and abbots were among the realm's leading landholders, and monasteries were not just religious communities but economic centres, custodians of learning, and political voices. Reform currents were moving through parts of Western Europe, emphasising discipline and tighter clerical standards, and England was not isolated from them. Kings influenced church appointments, and churchmen in turn helped legitimise kingship. A coronation was a sacred act, and a ruler's standing was strengthened by visible support from senior clergy. But church politics could also be international. Connections to Rome and to reform-minded continental circles meant English church leadership was part of a wider conversation, one that Norman rulers understood and could later exploit. Defence depended on a mixture of professionalism and obligation. The king's elite were the housecarls, well-armed, paid retainers, many of them hardened veterans, capable of holding a line in close combat. Around them, when danger threatened, the third could be called, a levy of free men obliged to serve for a limited period, providing manpower and local strength. This system worked well for sudden raids and for regional emergencies. It was less well suited to a prolonged coordinated campaign, that required keeping large numbers in the field through harvest season, paying them, feeding them, and holding them together as months passed. England could be strong on land, but its coasts were long and exposed. The Viking legacy still shaped policy and memory. For generations, England had faced attacks, paid tributes, and at times been ruled by Scandinavian kings. Even after the old wave of conquest had receded, the North Sea remained a highway for ambitious war leaders. The Channel, too, was a corridor, not a wall. An organised invasion was difficult, but not impossible, especially if England's forces were drawn away, divided by regional rivalries, or uncertain about who had the right to command them. And that brings the long-term vulnerability into focus. Dynastic uncertainty. With Edward dead and no clear heir of his body, the kingdom's institutions could choose a king, but they could not silence rival claims. The very strengths of Anglo-Saxon England, its powerful earldoms, its consultative politics, its mobilization system could become weaknesses when contested legitimacy encouraged men to hedge, delay, or switch sides. In 1066, England had money, law, and seasoned warriors. What it lacked was the one thing that made all those tools decisive: uncontested unity at the top. That uncertainty at the top had a long prehistory, and it begins with Edward himself, Edward the Confessor, whose life linked England to Normandy in ways that would later prove explosive. Edward was the son of King Athelred and Emma of Normandy. When Denmark's Knut seized England, Edward spent much of his youth in exile across the Channel, living among Norman kin and absorbing their politics, their church culture, and their habits of patronage. When Edward finally returned to claim the English throne in 1042, he did not arrive as a blank slate. He arrived with friendships, expectations, and a sense that trusted men could be imported from abroad. Those Norman connections mattered later not only because they shaped his household and church appointments, but because they gave outsiders a story to tell that Edward had long been part of the Norman world and might naturally look there when thinking about succession. But Edward did not rule in a vacuum, and in England the strongest power outside the crown was the great Earl of Wessex, Godwin. Godwin had risen under Knut, showing an ability to survive regime change and to thrive within it. Under Edward, he became something close to indispensable. Wessex was the kingdom's richest and most strategically central earldom, and Godwin's influence extended well beyond it. Through careful marriage alliances, control of land, and a network of clients, men who owed their advancement to him, Godwin built a family power base that could move the levers of government. His sons would inherit not just estates, but leverage, the ability to supply troops, to sway local officials, and to shape what the Witan was willing to accept. Edward, by contrast, had to rebuild royal authority after years in which kingship had been entangled with Danish rule and powerful earls. He needed support, but he also needed room to act. This set up the defining tension of his reign: a king with Norman ties trying to establish his own circle, and an English magnate family whose dominance made them hard to control. The relationship between Edward and the Godwins swung between cooperation and open confrontation. The clearest crisis came in 1051. A violent dispute in Dover, sparked by the behaviour of visiting nobles connected to Edward's Norman circle, escalated into a test of strength. Edward demanded that Godwin punish the town. Godwin resisted, not wanting to attack his own people and perhaps not wanting to set a precedent of enforcing a foreign faction's will. The result was political showdown, with other earls and churchmen backing the king at that moment. Godwin and his family were driven into exile. This episode revealed two important realities. First, Edward could still marshal enough support to strike at the Godwins when the rest of the elite agreed the family had gone too far. Second, that support was conditional and fragile. Godwin's exile did not last. Within a year he returned, gathered allies, and applied pressure that the kingdom's leadership could not ignore. Edward was forced to accept the family back, and the king's Norman associates lost ground. Some fled, others were sidelined. The political lesson was unmistakable. The greatest earl could be challenged, but removing him permanently risked instability, even civil conflict. From then on, the Godwinsons tightened their grip. When Godwin died in 153, his son Harold succeeded as Earl of Wessex, an extraordinary inheritance of power and prestige. Other sons and relatives held additional earldoms and influence, giving the family a national footprint, not just regional strength, but a web of command across shires and along coasts. Harold, capable and increasingly prominent, became the essential man of the realm, leading campaigns, negotiating with rivals, and acting as the king's chief secular partner, whether Edward liked it or not. All of this played out against the most destabilizing fact of Edward's reign. He produced no clear heir. Edward was married to Edith, Godwin's daughter, a match that should have bound king and earl together. It linked the crown directly to the kingdom's dominant family, and in theory promised children who would reconcile competing interests. Yet no heir came. Later tradition sometimes hinted at a celibate or unusually restrained marriage, but historians treat such claims cautiously. What matters is the political outcome. Decades passed with no son to silence disputes, and no obvious adult prince waiting in the wings. The lack of an heir made succession less a matter of bloodline and more a matter of politics, who had the strongest claim, who had the backing of leading men, and who could keep the peace. Candidates existed, but each came with problems. Edward had a close male relative in exile, and then in Hungary, Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, who represented the older royal line. When he was finally brought back to England in 1057, it looked like a solution. But he died soon after arriving. His son Edgar Aetheling survived, yet in 1066 he was still very young, without the military reputation and mature alliances expected of a king in dangerous times. As Edward aged, decision-making at court became more consequential and more ambiguous. He promoted churchmen and advisers with continental links, including Normans, while also relying on Harold and the great English earls to govern and fight. Each choice could be read as a sign of intended succession. Favour shown to Norman contacts could be interpreted later loudly as preparation for a Norman heir. Reliance on Harold could be read as quiet endorsement of the man who actually kept the kingdom functioning. Edward's own sanctity and reputation for piety, which grew after his death, only made these interpretations more potent. If a saintly king had chosen someone, that choice could be framed as morally binding. By the final years, the problem could no longer be avoided. Edward was ill at the start of 1066, and the question became urgent. Who would receive the kingdom, and on what authority? Here the sources pull in different directions, and the conflict matters because it fed the propaganda wars that followed. The Norman version, preserved in later Norman narratives, insisted that Edward had promised the throne to William, Duke of Normandy. Years earlier, often dated to the early 1050s, around the time Edward briefly had the upper hand against the Godwins. English accounts, especially those closest in time, emphasize a different moment, Edward's deathbed, when he was surrounded by the leading men of England, and when Harold was present as the foremost earl. In this telling, Edward commended the kingdom to Harold's protection, words that could be understood as naming him successor or, more cautiously, as urging him to safeguard the realm and the young Edgar. Even the same phrase could be politically repurposed. To commend the kingdom might mean, I choose you to be king, or it might mean, I entrust you to keep order until a rightful heir is recognized. In a system where the Witan's recognition mattered, ambiguity was dangerous. It left room for multiple claims to be presented as lawful, even sacred, William as the promised heir, Harold as the chosen guardian and effective ruler, Edgar as the blood prince, and others beyond the Channel and the North Sea, watching for opportunity. When Edward died on the 5th of January 1066, he left behind not only a wealthy, organised kingdom, but a vacuum at its centre, created by a reign shaped by Norman ties, dominated by the rise of the Godwinsons, and never resolved by a single, undisputed heir. The struggle that followed would not begin with armies on the coast. It would begin in the chamber of a dead king, and in the arguments men made about what he had truly meant. Edward was scarcely gone when England's leading men moved to prevent the worst outcome of any succession crisis: hesitation. The next day, the Witan, the council of powerful earls, bishops, and royal officials, recognised Harald Godwinson as king. In a kingdom where custom mattered as much as blood, that decision carried real weight. It was not a simple coronation of the next in line, because there was no adult, universally accepted heir. It was a choice, made under pressure, about who could hold the realm together. Harold's advantages were practical, and everyone in the room knew it. As Earl of Wessex, he controlled England's richest and most central power base. He had spent years acting as the king's chief lay partner, leading armies in Wales, managing disputes between great men, and enforcing royal authority across the shires. He was not a prince by birth in the old royal line, but he was the man with the networks, the experience, and the resources that could be mobilised immediately. Against that stood Edgar Atheling, the boy with the best blood claim and the least ability to command. Choosing Edgar might satisfy dynastic purity, but it risked inviting ambitious rivals to rule in his name. Choosing Harold meant adult leadership and continuity of government, even if it invited arguments about legitimacy. Harold also moved with deliberate speed. He was crowned on the 6th of January, the day after Edward's death, an unusually swift transition, but not a careless one. The timing sent a message. England had not fallen leaderless even for a week. The kingdom's institutions still functioned, the Witan still chose, the church still anointed, the law still ran. That was the claim Harold needed most, to look not like a usurper seizing a prize, but like the lawful answer to an emergency. The coronation itself reinforced that message. It took place at Westminster, beside the new abbey Edward had founded, and had just been buried in a site heavy with royal symbolism, and it was performed by the Archbishop of York, Ealdred, in most accounts, rather than Stigand of Canterbury, whose position was controversial in Rome. That detail mattered. To be anointed was to be set apart with sacred authority, but an anointing could be questioned if the officiant was questioned. Later Norman writers would insist Stigand crowned Harold, because it helped portray the accession as tainted from the beginning. English sources generally push back by emphasizing Ealdred's role. Even in the ceremony, legitimacy was already being argued over by who laid hands on the king, and by which story people would repeat afterward. Almost immediately, chroniclers began to frame Harold's reign through signs and portents. Some of this is the normal language of medieval history, where God's will is read in storms, famines, and strange lights in the sky. But the year 1066 offered something vivid and unforgettable, a comet, later identified as Halley's, appearing in the spring. English and Norman accounts alike noticed it, but they did not agree on what it meant. For writers supporting the Norman cause, the comet became a warning from heaven, an omen of Harold's doomed and wrongful rule. Other traditions treated it more broadly as a sign of upheaval to come, not necessarily a verdict on Harold alone. What is consistent is how quickly the heavens were recruited into politics. When armies later marched, chroniclers could say the sky had already declared who would win. Harold, for his part, could not rule by omens. He had to rule by holding together a coalition of powerful interests that did not automatically love him simply because he wore the crown. England was not a centralised monarchy in the modern sense. It was a realm where earls commanded regions with their own loyalties, and where the king's authority depended on cooperation as much as command. His immediate priorities were therefore both political and administrative: keep the great earldoms aligned, prevent local rivalries from turning violent, and secure the loyalty of the church. The most important partnership was with the brothers Edwin and Morcar, young earls whose influence in Mercia and Northumbria mattered as much as Harold's in Wessex. Their support signalled national unity rather than a purely southern takeover. Harold had already tied himself to them by marriage to their sister Edith, an alliance that strengthened his position in the Midlands and the north, even if it complicated his earlier relationship with a different partner and invited later moral criticism from hostile writers. In 1066, the political meaning was clearer than any personal one. Harold needed England's regions to accept his kingship as a shared settlement, not a Godwin family monopoly. Yet unity was fragile. Some men had long resented the dominance of the Godwinsons, and one grievance in particular would not stay quiet: the exile of Harold's brother Tostig, former Earl of Northumbria, driven out after a revolt and replaced by Morcar. Harold's willingness to accept that change had kept the peace in 1065, but it left an embittered enemy with a personal cause. Tostig's anger would soon become a national threat, because in a year of contested succession every exile and every disappointed claimant could look for foreign allies. And that, above all, shaped Harold's first months as king. He had to treat the realm as already under attack, even before any ships were sighted. Across the Channel, William of Normandy had a claim ready to be turned into an invasion. To the north, the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, could invoke older Scandinavian rights and the memory of Snout's empire. Edgar Aetheling's bloodline, though not a military threat, offered a banner around which malcontents could rally if Harold stumbled. Even internal dissent could become an invitation to outsiders. If England looked divided, it became a prize. So Harold prepared defensively with the tools English kings had always used. He relied on the fyrd, the militia obligation that could be summoned from shires, and on his own household troops and the professional corps of his army, the housecarls, men trained and equipped for close combat, loyal to the king and the great lords who maintained them. He also needed ships, because the first line of defence against a Norman-style assault was to prevent a landing or to force it under unfavourable conditions. Sources suggest that in the summer he assembled a fleet and kept forces along the south coast, waiting through long weeks for the expected blow. But defence created its own problems. Keeping a large force in the field was expensive and politically difficult. Farmers could not stay away from harvest forever. Supplies ran down. Local communities felt the burden of provisioning armed men. Harold's government had to balance readiness with sustainability, always guessing not only where an enemy might strike, but when. The central danger of 1066 was that England might face not one invasion, but several, arriving in different places at different times. Through all of this, Harold's greatest challenge was not simply military, it was narrative. A king in England needed the acceptance of the realm's leading men and the church, but acceptance could be attacked by rival claimants from abroad. William would present Harold as a perjurer and a thief of a promised crown. Hardrada could present himself as the heir to an older northern dominion. Edgar's supporters could claim Harold had leapt over the rightful bloodline. Harold's answer was essentially the same in every action he took early on: that he had been chosen, crowned, and anointed according to English custom, to preserve order at the moment of danger. In the calm language of law and continuity, Harold tried to make his kingship look inevitable. But 1066 was not a year that allowed a new king time to settle in. Legitimacy could be debated in councils and chronicles, but it would be tested, finally, by who could keep England secure when the challengers came. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, did not see Harold's swift coronation as a settlement. He saw it as a provocation, an outcome that threatened to lock him out of a prize he believed had already been offered. William's power in Normandy mattered because it made his claim more than a distant complaint. He had been duke since childhood, and Normandy was not a peaceful training ground. His early years were marked by aristocratic violence and repeated challenges to ducal authority. Surviving those years and then imposing order gave William a reputation for hard rule and relentless focus. By the 1060s he had proven himself in war, most notably by expanding Norman influence westward into Maine and by keeping powerful lords in line. He also anchored his legitimacy at home with a careful relationship to the church. William's parents had not been married. His enemies could and did use that against him. Yet he secured recognition, married into high nobility, patronized monasteries, and presented himself as a lawful prince by performance, by governing, judging, and winning. That background shaped what came next. If William meant to challenge Harold, he could not do it as a romantic adventurer. He had to do it as a ruler capable of planning, paying, and persuading, because an invasion of England was an enormous logistical gamble. The basis of William's claim rested on three main supports, and each was framed to sound as if it followed accepted custom. First was kinship. Edward the Confessor had spent years in exile among the Normans, and William was related to him, though not closely enough for the relationship alone to settle anything. In a world where blood mattered, even distant kinship could be used as a starting point, especially when a king left no son. Second was the alleged promise. Norman accounts insist that Edward at some point indicated William should succeed him, and that this promise was known in high circles. English sources are quieter and less supportive, and modern historians treat the certainty of such a promise with caution. Edward's court politics were complicated, and even if Edward spoke favourably of William, it is not clear that an English king could simply designate an heir without the consent of the kingdom's leading men. Still, as a diplomatic argument, the idea of a royal promise was powerful. It made William's claim sound like the continuation of Edward's will rather than a foreign land grab. Third, and most explosive, was the assertion that Harold himself had confirmed William's right. That story would become central to Norman propaganda and will be taken up in detail. But its importance here is simple. It transformed the dispute from one of competing candidates into one of betrayal. If Harold had sworn to support William and then took the crown, William could present his invasion not as aggression, but as punishment and restoration. William's next task was to turn claim into capability. A duke could not simply order an overseas invasion and expect every lord to follow. Normandy was feudal, and obligations had limits. Many knights owed service for local defence, not months abroad in a risky campaign. William therefore built a coalition with promises. Land was the language of reward, and England, rich, fertile, and comparatively centralised, offered the greatest prize a warrior aristocracy could imagine. William attracted not only Normans but also men from neighbouring regions, Brittany, Flanders, and parts of northern France. Each would come for a share of conquest, and each would expect it in writing and in results. Ships had to be assembled, and that required more than ambition. Timber, nails, rope, sailcloth, food, fodder for horses, barrels for water and wine. An invasion was a supply chain. William also needed transport for cavalry, because his army depended on mounted warriors and on the ability to move quickly once ashore. The sources celebrate this preparation with a sense of inevitability, but it was full of uncertainty. The Channel's weather could strand a fleet for weeks, and a single storm could break ships and morale before a battle was ever fought. To strengthen the venture, William sought moral and political legitimacy beyond Normandy itself. That meant the Church, especially the papacy. William's relationship with Rome was not frictionless. but he had cultivated a reputation as a reforming ruler who supported monastic renewal. The Norman case against Harold could be framed in religious terms. A sworn oath had been violated, a rightful succession had been stolen, a kingdom had been taken under questionable ecclesiastical auspices. If the Pope could be persuaded, the invasion could be cast as more than a dynastic dispute. It could be presented as a just cause, even a kind of sanctioned correction of wrongdoing. Later tradition holds that William received a papal banner, a symbol that his cause had spiritual approval. How precisely this support was granted, and on what evidence, is debated. Our clearest narratives come from Norman writers with every reason to emphasize Rome's endorsement. But whether the papal support was explicit or cautiously worded, the political effect was real. It helped William rally men who might otherwise hesitate to fight fellow Christians for a crown. It also helped define Harold not merely as a rival, but as a man under moral suspicion. Behind the diplomacy was a hard military calculation. Norman forces had notable advantages in the style of warfare they practiced, and the command culture William enforced. Norman armies were used to combined arms, cavalry to shock and pursue, infantry to hold and press, and archers to disrupt and weaken. They were also used to campaigns and castle warfare, to moving in hostile territory and securing lines of supply. William's rule encouraged discipline and centralized direction, and he had a habit of appointing men for ability and loyalty rather than tolerating endless private feuds. None of this guaranteed victory over English soldiers who were experienced, well-armed, and fierce in close combat. But it meant William arrived with a force designed for flexibility. By late summer, the dispute over England had become two stories running side by side. Norman chroniclers increasingly portrayed William as the rightful heir, chosen by Edward, confirmed by Harold's oath, blessed by the Church, and compelled to act when cheated. English sources, closer to the workings of the Witan and the reality of Harold's coronation, were more likely to treat William as an outsider pressing a claim that England had not accepted. The difference was not just interpretation, it was strategy. William understood that conquest required a narrative as well as an army. If he could make the world believe he was reclaiming what was his, then the invasion would look less like an act of piracy and more like the enforcement of order. And so, while Harold watched the coastline and tried to hold England together, William gathered ships, men, and legitimacy, preparing to turn a contested promise into a crossing, and a crossing into a kingdom, to make Harold's coronation look like a crime rather than a choice. William needed a single, unforgettable charge that Harold had sworn to support William's claim, and then broke a sacred oath. The story begins a couple of years before the conquest, with a puzzling journey across the Channel. Sometime around 1064, Harald Godwinson left England and sailed for the continent. Why he went is one of the great uncertainties of the whole crisis. Norman writers later insisted Edward the Confessor sent Harold to Normandy to confirm William as Edward's heir, making Harold an official messenger who then gave his personal guarantee. Other possibilities have been argued, including that Harold went to negotiate the release of family hostages who had been held since the Godwin family's earlier fall from power, or that he travelled on a more routine diplomatic mission that later grew in the telling. The English evidence is thin, and even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually brisk on major politics, gives no clear explanation. What can be said with confidence is that Harold's trip proved politically disastrous, because once he was on the far shore, control of the narrative shifted to Normandy. The accounts of Harold's arrival are dramatic, and again they vary. The most widely repeated version is that Harold's ship was blown off course, and he landed on the coast of Ponthieu, north of Normandy. There he was seized by Count Guy of Ponthieu, who treated him less like an honoured visitor and more like valuable property, someone whose status could be converted into money or influence. This detail matters because it frames Harold as a captive from the very start, not as a free negotiator. The story continues with William intervening. According to Norman narratives, the Duke demanded Harold's release, bringing him into Norman custody, not as a prisoner, but as a guest under William's protection. The Bayeux tapestry supports the broad shape of this. Harold arrives, is taken to Guy, and then is transferred to William, once in Normandy. Harold seems to have been treated with high status. He accompanies William on campaign, most famously in operations against Brittany, and is shown in the tapestry fighting alongside the Normans. Some accounts even claim William presented Harold with arms, a gesture that could be read as honour, but also as incorporation into William's personal circle. Whether Harold joined willingly or had no practical choice is impossible to prove. In a ducal court, hospitality could be a form of control. A great man might be feasted, housed and praised, while still being constrained by the simple fact that he was far from home and surrounded by the Duke's men. It is in this setting that the alleged oath appears, an oath that became the moral core of William's case. The Norman version says Harold swore to support William's succession to England, and in some tellings also promised to secure the handing over of key English strongholds, or to marry into William's family, binding the agreement with kinship. The story is not consistent from one source to another, which is part of why historians argue so fiercely about it. But the central point in Norman propaganda is stable. Harold gave his word, and that word was not ordinary. It was sworn on holy relics. Relics were not symbolic decoration in medieval politics. They were instruments of fear and legitimacy. The bones of saints, fragments associated with holy lives, sacred objects kept in churches. These were believed to carry a kind of spiritual presence. To swear on relics was to place one's promise under divine witness and potential divine punishment. In a culture where oath-keeping underpinned lordship, law and peace agreements, a relic oath was meant to be binding in the deepest possible sense. It made a political promise into a religious act. Breaking it was not merely disloyalty, it could be framed as perjury before God. This is why the Bayeux tapestry lingers on the scene. It shows Harold with hands placed on reliquaries, and its captions present the moment as a solemn commitment. Later Norman chroniclers expand it further, emphasizing that Harold did not understand what he was swearing upon until the relics were revealed, as if to suggest a trap, or, just as usefully, to suggest that even if he felt pressured, the oath still counted. Either way, the scene is carefully crafted to deliver a verdict. Harold is not simply a rival king, he is an oath-breaker. English sources do not offer the same clarity. They do not celebrate an oath, and they do not concede that Harold bound England to William. That silence does not prove nothing happened, but it does make it harder to accept the Norman version at face value. Modern historians therefore tend to separate what is plausible from what is rhetorically useful. Many accept that some form of pledge may have been extracted from Harold while he was in William's power, because such coerced promises were common tools of medieval politics. But there is strong disagreement over the circumstances and content, whether Harold was truly free to refuse, whether the oath concerned the succession at all, and whether any promise, especially one made abroad under pressure, could override the authority of England's leading men to choose a king. What remains most plausible is that William took advantage of Harold's vulnerable position to obtain a commitment he could later weaponize. Even a vague promise could be sharpened after the fact. Once Harold was crowned in January 1086, William's propagandists could present the oath as clear, absolute, and sacred. The tapestry and the chronicles did not merely record events. They argued a case, aimed at Norman allies, the Church, and anyone whose support might hinge on whether this war looked just. By the time the invasion fleet assembled, the disputed oath had become more than a contested memory. It was a political weapon, one that turned ambition into righteousness, and a foreign attack into claimed enforcement of order. And in 1066, with rivals gathering on multiple horizons, Harold would soon discover that the deadliest threats were not only armies, but stories powerful enough to mobilize them. While William sharpened his case with relics and rhetoric, another claimant looked toward England from the far north, one who needed no disputed oath at all, only a tradition of Scandinavian ambition and an opening in English politics. Harold Sigurdsson, remembered as Harald Hardrada, was King of Norway and a veteran of almost every kind of war the 11th century could offer. As a young man he had fought at Stiklestad, then wandered into exile, serving first in the east and then in Byzantium with the famed Varangian Guard. Later sagas describe riches, campaigns, and a hard-earned reputation for ruthlessness and discipline. Whatever embellishments the stories carry, the essential truth is clear. By 1066, Hardrada was not a raider looking for plunder. He was a king with resources, experience, and a belief that the English crown might be within reach. His claim rested on an older agreement whose exact terms are debated, but whose political value was obvious. In Scandinavian tradition there had been an understanding between King Magnus of Norway and King Harthacnut of Denmark and England. If one died without an heir, the other would inherit. When Harthacnut died in 1042, the English chose Edward the Confessor instead, and the agreement, whether formal treaty or later rationalization, was ignored. Magnus's successor, Hardrada, could present himself as the heir to a northern compact that England had brushed aside. It was not a claim many Englishmen recognized, but it gave Hardrada a usable justification, especially to his own followers. Like William, he needed a story that made conquest sound like rightful succession. Hardrada's opportunity arrived through an English exile, with very personal reasons to see Harold Godwinson fall. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother, had been Earl of Northumbria, an earldom unlike the others, politically prickly and fiercely protective of its own customs. Tostig's rule had become deeply unpopular. The reasons given in the sources include heavy-handed justice, harsh taxation, and the presence of southern favourites in a region that resented outside interference. In 1065 the Northumbrians rose in rebellion, killed Tostig's supporters, and demanded a new earl, Morcar, brother of Edwin of Mercia. King Edward had wanted Tostig restored by force. Harold, then the most powerful man in England, chose a different path. He accepted the rebels' demand, likely to avoid civil war, and because he needed northern support for the succession he could see coming. To Tostig, it looked like betrayal, his own brother sacrificing him for political convenience. Tostig went into exile, nursing grievances that were not just personal but strategic. If Harold's kingship depended on unity, then Tostig's best weapon was division. Tostig first tested England's defences on his own. In early 1066 he appeared with a fleet and struck along the southern and eastern coasts, hitting places like the Isle of Wight and the Kentish shoreline, then moving north to raid the Humber region. These were not full-scale invasion attempts. They functioned more like reconnaissance by violence, measuring local resistance, probing harbours, showing that the coast could be reached, and gathering supplies and allies where possible. The response was mixed. Some local forces resisted, others were caught unprepared. But the larger message was unmistakable. England's shores were open to sudden attack, and the year would not be decided by one enemy alone. Tostig's raids also revealed a second truth. He could not win his earldom back by himself. His following was too small, and in the north he found little love. Eventually he moved to Scotland and then sought a stronger partner. Hardrada, with his royal army and his appetite for a great prize, was the answer. The alliance made sense for both men. Tostig could offer guidance, local knowledge, and a political wedge. The fact that Northumbria had already rejected him, and might therefore be vulnerable to intimidation or bargaining. Hardrada could offer ships, seasoned fighters, and a king's authority. Together, they could transform scattered coastal trouble into a serious bid for the throne. All of this created a strategic dilemma that haunted Harold Godwinson's first months as king. The most obvious danger lay to the south. William of Normandy assembling ships, securing papal support, and turning a disputed oath into a crusade-like justification, Harold concentrated his main forces on the southern coast through the summer, calling out the Fyrd, England's militia, and keeping his elite household troops, the housecarls, ready. But militia service was not endless. Men had farms to tend, food to harvest, and families to feed. Holding a large army at full readiness for months strained the kingdom's resources. Meanwhile, the north could not be ignored. Northumbria's politics made it the most likely landing ground for a Scandinavian assault. The region had strong ties to the wider Norse world and long experience of Scandinavian rule. York was a wealthy prize and a vital administrative centre. The Humber and Ouse offered navigable routes into the interior, and Northumbria had only recently undergone rebellion and leadership change, meaning loyalties were not settled, even if the local earls, Morcar and Edwin, were now part of Harold's coalition. Their authority in the region had to be proven, and their willingness to coordinate with Harold could not be assumed without tension. In 1066, the unity of England existed, but it was newly stitched together and still vulnerable at the seams. Communication made everything harder. News travelled at the speed of a horse on rough roads or a ship hugging the coast, passing from messenger to messenger, never perfectly reliable. Rumours could outrun facts. Fleets could appear before warnings arrived. Decisions, therefore, had to be made with partial information. Was the main threat gathering in Normandy, or would the first blow fall in the north? Holding both fronts was beyond any medieval state without paying a heavy price. And as summer wore on, the King of Norway and the exiled Earl of Northumbria were moving toward the final step, turning claim, grievance, and reconnaissance into invasion. In September, the northern blow fell first. Harald Hardrada sailed into the Humber with a large fleet. Later tradition speaks of hundreds of ships, though exact numbers are uncertain, and he moved quickly up the river system that led toward York. The waterways did much of the work for him, carrying men, weapons, and supplies deep into England with far less strain than an overland march. Tostig came with him, not as a mere guide, but as a political instrument, proof that this was not simply a foreign raid, but an invasion aimed at the heart of English rule in the north. The local response fell to the earls who governed the region. Morcar of Northumbria and his brother Edwin of Mercia gathered what forces they could, household troops, local levies, and the experienced fighters attached to their followings. They could not wait for the king in the south. York was too important, and an invading army so close to it would pull men and loyalties like a magnet. The earls chose to meet Hardrada before he could settle in, gather hostages, or force the city into a negotiated submission. The English took a defensive position near Fulford, just south of York, where the land narrowed between water and marsh. The choice was sensible. Constriction could blunt the advantage of a larger army, and difficult ground could disrupt the cohesion of an attacker. If the invaders were forced to fight in a tight space, the English line might hold long enough to break their momentum, or at least make the cost of victory so high that Hardrada would be slowed before York. But Hardrada had not come north to test England lightly. The battle unfolded as a hard grinding contest along that constrained front. At first the English line did what a defensive line is supposed to do. It absorbed the pressure and tried to keep its shape. Yet the ground that seemed protective could also become a trap. On one side, wetland limited movement and made it difficult to shift men to meet a developing threat. On the other, the water and marsh restricted retreat. Once the fighting began, small local advantages mattered more than grand manoeuvre, and a line that bent in the wrong place could fail suddenly. As the pressure built, the English formation began to give way, not everywhere at once, but in sections. Sources differ on exactly how the collapse began, but the general pattern is clear. Hardrada's army forced openings, exploited them, and turned strain into rupture. The defenders were pinned by the landscape and by their own need to protect the route to York. When part of the line broke, the rest could not easily redraw itself. A defensive position that depends on steadiness can become disastrous when steadiness is lost. The result was a defeat severe enough that it was remembered not as a mere setback, but as a tearing open of the north. The immediate consequences were stark. York, the greatest city in northern England and a critical centre for administration and wealth, was suddenly exposed. The earls had fought in part to prevent negotiation under duress. Instead, their defeat ensured exactly that. With the local field army beaten, the city's leaders had little choice but to come to terms. York's vulnerability was not only military, it was psychological. A Scandinavian king, famed, experienced, and now victorious, stood at the gates of the region's capital. For a kingdom already bracing for danger from Normandy, the knowledge that a second major invasion had broken through must have felt like the year turning into a vice. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources speak of heavy casualties, though medieval numbers are always slippery. Chroniclers had reasons to exaggerate, to magnify the glory of a victor, to heighten the tragedy of defeat, or to make the consequences feel inevitable in hindsight. Some accounts suggest thousands of English dead, and later narratives can be more dramatic still. What can be said with confidence is more limited, but still grim. This was not a polite battle with light losses. Fighting on restrictive ground, followed by a collapse and a pursued retreat, tends to produce high casualties, especially among levies who break and run. Even if the precise figures cannot be trusted, the scale of the defeat is confirmed by what followed: York's swift submission and the need for an immediate royal response. Fulford, therefore, changed the strategic math for Harald Godwinson in a single stroke. Until then, his central problem had been how to hold England together while watching the southern coast for William. Now the north was not merely threatened, it had been opened. A victorious Hardrada could consolidate, draw supplies from a rich region, and present himself as a viable king to men whose loyalty might bend under pressure. Every day that passed increased the chance that Hardrada's position would harden through hostages, tribute, or alliances, born of fear and pragmatism. When the news reached Harold, it forced a choice that would shape the rest of the year: speed over rest and risk over consolidation. The king could not allow an enemy to sit astride York and the Humber routes. He also could not afford to keep his best troops idle in the south, while a rival king established a foothold in the north. The solution was brutally simple: march hard, take the fight to Hardrada before the invasion could become permanent, and accept the costs that such haste would impose on men and horses. In that sense, Fulford was not only a battle, it was a hinge. It did not decide the crown on its own, but it set the conditions for the decision that followed. With the north shaken and York compromised, Harold's next move had to be immediate and decisive. The road now led toward a rapid march, a sudden confrontation, and a dramatic pivot from defeat to opportunity, because Hardrada, fresh from victory, would soon be met at Stamford Bridge. News of Fulford left Harald Godwinson no room for a slow, methodical response. If he hesitated, Hardrada could turn a battlefield victory into lasting control, collecting tribute, taking hostages, and presenting himself as a king with momentum. Harold's answer was one of the most demanding moves any medieval ruler could attempt: a rapid overland march from the south toward York, done not as a raid with a light retinue, but as the movement of a royal army that still needed to arrive ready to fight. A fast medieval march was not simply a matter of walking faster. It required usable roads, predictable stopping points, and strict discipline. England's main routes, old Roman roads in places, newer trackways in others, could carry men north, but they did not remove the basic problem of feeding an army on the move. Every extra day on the road consumed stores, wore down footwear, strained bodies, and increased the chance that men would drift away. Speed demanded organisation, columns that could keep formation, officers who could enforce pace and order, and a plan for provisions that did not collapse into hunger and disorder. Harold had one advantage that made speed possible. He could move quickly with his core household troops, the king's experienced fighting men, the professional element of his army, often described as housecarls. These were not seasonal farmers called up for a brief emergency. They were trained, armed, and accustomed to operating under command. Their cohesion mattered as much as their skill. A disciplined corps could march longer, keep better order in camp, and arrive in a state fit for battle, even if the march was punishing. Around this nucleus, Harold could concentrate additional forces as he went, drawing in local support and whatever levies could be raised quickly enough to keep up. That concentration was itself a logistical feat. Early medieval armies were not assembled by sending out a single instruction and waiting for everyone to appear at a fixed date and place. Men gathered unevenly, based on distance, local leadership, and willingness. Harold's authority as king helped, but it did not magically solve geography. To gain speed, he likely relied on those closest at hand, and on the reality that many in southern and midland England understood the stakes. Hardrada's presence in the north was not distant news. It threatened the unity of the realm and the legitimacy of the new king. A rapid march was therefore also a political act, proof that Harold would meet danger directly, and that he could still act like a king who commanded the kingdom's roads and resources. But the price of that speed was fatigue, and Harold must have known it. A hard march meant sore feet and strained legs for infantry, and for horses it meant exhaustion that could reduce their value in the crucial hours before a fight. Even if the housecarls held together, the less seasoned men attached to the host would suffer more. The faster the pace, the greater the risk that stragglers would be left behind. That equipment would be discarded, that tempers would fray. Harold's calculation, however, was clear. A tired army that arrived in time was preferable to a fresh army that arrived too late. Better to take a single sharp risk now than allow Hardrada to settle into the north and become harder to uproot. The route itself depended on cooperation from the regions Harold passed through. An army cannot move through the countryside without creating pressure on food, fodder and lodgings, and on the patience of local communities. There was always the potential for resentment, especially if supplies were seized rather than purchased or requisitioned through local authority. Yet Harold needed those same communities to function as his supply network. Regional leaders mattered. Earls, thegns, and local officials who could organise food deliveries, open storehouses, and keep order as troops passed. In a crisis year, the difference between support and resistance along the road could be the difference between an army that arrived coherent and an army that arrived scattered and half-fed. England's administrative habits helped, at least to a point. The kingdom had long experience with musters and obligations, and it had infrastructure of governance that could be used in an emergency. Still, the speed Harold attempted pushed those systems to their limits. The march north compressed time. There was less opportunity to gather fresh supplies, less time to negotiate, less room to handle problems gently. It demanded that people comply quickly, because the alternative was allowing an enemy king to dictate terms in York. Late September 1066 moved with startling rapidity. Hardrada's victory at Fulford opened the way to York, and York's submission followed soon after. Hardrada then positioned himself to receive hostages and guarantees, an act that was both practical and symbolic, a way of turning conquest into authority. Harold, receiving news in the south, moved north with urgency that suggests he understood exactly how narrow the window was. The timeline matters because it shows how little margin existed between a threat appearing and a battle being forced. In a world without instant communication, rapid action was the only substitute for foreknowledge. Harold's gamble was strategic as much as physical. He still expected William of Normandy to attempt a landing, and the longer Harold and his best men were absent from the south, the greater the danger there. Yet leaving Hardrada undefeated was equally unacceptable. Two rivals were pressing at once. Harold could not meet both simultaneously. His best chance was to defeat one decisively, fast enough that the victory would free him to turn and face the other. That meant striking Hardrada before the Norwegian king could disperse his army into garrisons, before winter weather complicated movement, and before northern political calculations began to tilt toward accommodation. So the march north was more than a race. It was a wager on timing. Harold bet that he could move quickly enough to catch Hardrada in a vulnerable moment, and that the blow he delivered would be final enough to prevent a drawn-out northern war. The entire plan depended on a decisive battle, one that would end the northern invasion outright, not merely bruise it. Only then could Harold hope to pivot back south and confront Normandy with whatever strength remained. By the time Harold's army neared York, the costs of the march were already being paid in aching bodies and worn nerves. But the urgency had achieved its purpose. Hardrada did not have the leisure to consolidate, and the English king was close enough to force a confrontation at once. The road from Fulford had led not to a slow siege or a cautious standoff, but to a sudden meeting of armies, where surprise, speed, and exhaustion would all matter, and where the northern crisis would be decided at Stamford Bridge. Harold's speed achieved what it was meant to achieve: contact before the northern invaders could settle. Harald Hardrada had taken York's submission and then moved east to Stamford Bridge, a crossing over the River Derwent, where hostages and supplies were to be delivered. It was, in a sense, a moment of confidence. Hardrada's army had just won at Fulford, and the local leadership had yielded. With York apparently secured and the English king thought to be far away, many Norwegians expected a day of bargaining, not a day of desperate fighting. Hardrada's position also reveals something practical about his mindset. A large army could not sit indefinitely in one place without eating the region bare, and a conqueror needed more than victories. He needed guarantees. Taking hostages was a standard method of turning submission into obligation. Stamford Bridge offered a convenient meeting point, close enough to York to pressure it, and far enough to avoid being hemmed in by the city's streets. The Norwegians, joined by Tostig Godwinson and his followers, waited on the riverbanks with the air of men collecting what they believed had already been won. Harold arrived with the opposite intention, not negotiation, but annihilation. His approach was so rapid that it appears to have caught Hardrada off guard. Medieval scouting could fail for many reasons: distance, fatigue, overconfidence, or simply the difficulty of tracking an army moving fast along known routes. Whatever the exact cause, the result was clear. The English host came onto the Norwegians suddenly, near enough to force an immediate decision, and with no time for Hardrada to arrange the careful battle order that had served him at Fulford. A crucial detail repeated by the sources is that a portion of the Norwegian force had left armour behind at their ships. That may not mean they were unarmed. Spears and shields could travel more easily than mail, but it does suggest a reduced readiness for an unexpected pitched battle. Hardrada's men had reason to think the day would involve ceremony and exchange, not a struggle for survival. Harold had deliberately chosen the moment when confidence and routine would be at their strongest. The first shock at Stamford Bridge was therefore not just physical, it was organisational. Hardrada had to assemble a fighting line, while the English pressed in. The Norwegians formed around their king, with Tostig's men beside them, trying to hold a position near the crossing. The English, arriving in force and with a disciplined corps, aimed to break that line quickly because the longer the fight lasted, the more time it gave the scattered Norwegians to rally, and the more chance there was that Hardrada could stabilise the battle into something like Fulford again. It is here that one of the most famous anecdotes enters the story. A lone defender said to have held the bridge against the English advance, buying time for his comrades before he was killed. The account is vivid and has been repeated for centuries, but its details are uncertain and may be shaped by storytelling. Still, the fact that later writers felt the need for such a moment suggests a real tactical problem. Crossings create bottlenecks, and even a small delay can matter when one army is trying to form and the other is trying to prevent it. Once the English forced their way across and brought their strength to bear, the battle widened into a brutal close-range contest. Hardrada's men were experienced fighters, and they did not collapse at first contact. They fought hard enough to create a dense knot of resistance, shield against shield, spear and axe, at close quarters. But the conditions favoured Harald. Surprise reduced Norwegian coordination. The English had arrived with urgency and a clear purpose, and Hardrada's army was not fully concentrated in one place. Some of it was on the field, some at the ships, and some in motion between. As the struggle intensified, the battle turned on leadership and momentum. Harald Hardrada was killed in the fighting, according to later tradition, struck by an arrow to the throat, though the exact manner cannot be confirmed with certainty. What matters is the effect. The death of a king in the midst of combat is not merely a casualty, it is a shock to command morale and cohesion. Hardrada had been the central figure holding together a coalition of ambition, reputation, and fear. When he fell, the invasion lost its anchor. The Norwegians attempted to recover by rallying under another leader, and their reinforcements did arrive from the direction of the ships, now racing toward the sound of battle. But the pace of events left them little room. Men arriving late were thrown into a field already decided by exhaustion and slaughter. The English pressure, once established, pushed the fight toward a rout, because when a line breaks in early medieval warfare, killing accelerates. A retreat becomes a scramble becomes pursuit, and pursuit in armour and with anger high becomes mass death. Tostig Godwinson died as well, refusing to abandon the cause he had chosen. His end closed a bitter chapter of internal English politics, but it did not simplify Harold's situation as much as it might have seemed. The victory was decisive, yet it was not free. By the end of the day, the northern invasion had collapsed. The survivors, now led by Hardrada's son, Olaf, were offered terms to leave. The sources emphasize how few ships were needed to carry the remnants back. Later writers often give the striking figure of 24 ships returning out of a much larger fleet. The exact number may be stylized, but the message is consistent. The army that had threatened England in September had been cut down to a fraction. For Harald, Stamford Bridge was a sudden victory, but it was also a costly one. He had forced a battle at the end of a punishing march, and then fought it at full intensity. Men were killed, others were wounded in ways that would not heal quickly. Equipment was damaged, strength was spent, units were scattered. Even in triumph, an army does not instantly reset. It needs food, rest, and time, things Harald did not truly have. Most dangerously, the battle consumed the very resource Harald had been gambling with all a long time. Stamford Bridge closed the northern crisis, but it narrowed the window of safety in the south. Harald had won the kind of decisive battle he needed, yet the kingdom's other threat had not disappeared. It was still out there, across the channel, waiting for wind and opportunity, and while the English king stood among the dead on the banks of the Derwent, the next phase of 1066 was already moving toward him. While Harold's army caught its breath in the north, Normandy had been waiting on something no general could command: the wind. William had spent the summer and early autumn gathering ships, men, horses and supplies along the Channel coast, especially around the mouth of the river Dives and later at St. Valery. The invasion force was large by the standards of the day. Normans at its core, but reinforced by allies and adventurers from across northern France, drawn by promises of land and favour. Yet for all that preparation, the fleet could not safely cross until the weather turned. The sources describe long delays, weeks of restlessness, and the strain of feeding an army that was ready but idle. Ships had to be held together, horses had to be kept fit, men had to be paid, persuaded, and prevented from drifting away. A medieval host could unravel quietly if it sat too long without action. William's advantage was that he had built his expedition with a clear purpose and firm command. Still, the delay carried risk. Every day that passed was another day Harold might strengthen the southern coast. Another day the political moment might shift. Another day the invasion might look like a boast rather than a reality. At last, late in September, the conditions changed. A favourable wind rose, often described as a shift, that allowed ships to run west to east across the Channel, and William moved quickly to seize the moment. The crossing itself was a gamble, but it was a controlled one. The fleet sailed in a mass, with efforts to keep ships together in darkness and open water. Later Norman-friendly accounts emphasise order and providence. English sources emphasise the suddenness and threat. What can be said with confidence is that William got across intact, with horses and supplies, and he landed where he intended to land. The Norman army came ashore at Pevensey on the Sussex coast, inside the curve of a natural harbour and beside the ruins of an old Roman fort. The location mattered. Pevensey offered a defensible point, a place where ships could be brought in and protected, and a perimeter that could be held while the army organised itself on English soil. The first priority was simple: do not be pushed back into the sea. An invader at the shoreline is vulnerable, half unloaded, scattered, and dependent on the weather behind him. So William's men moved immediately to fortify. They did not need to invent defences from nothing. The Roman walls at Pevensey still stood in part, forming a strong enclosure even after centuries. Within or alongside those remains, the Normans established a fortified base, strengthening earthworks, setting guards, and organising the camp so that a sudden English counterattack would meet obstacles rather than confusion. This was the Norman way of war: speed, entrenchment, and the creation of strongpoints. A secure foothold turned a raid into a campaign. From Pevensey, William shifted part of his force east to the Hastings area, where another fortification was raised. Whether it was first a simple earth and timber work or more substantial from the outset, the purpose was the same: to anchor the army, store supplies, and protect the line back to the ships. Two bases close enough to support each other reduced the danger of isolation. They also let William control a stretch of coast, making it harder for English forces to cut him off from reinforcement or escape. With defences taking shape, the next task was to feed men and animals. An army's appetite is relentless, and an invading army cannot rely on local markets to welcome it. So the Normans foraged, collecting grain, livestock, and anything useful from the surrounding countryside. In practice, foraging blurred easily into plunder. Villages could be stripped, barns emptied, animals driven away, and fields trampled. The effect on local communities was immediate: loss of food, loss of winter stores, fear, and displacement. It also had a political effect, because news of harsh foraging spread faster than armies. William's foraging served more than hunger. It was pressure. It signalled that the invasion was not a demonstration meant to bargain. It was an occupation in the making. It challenged Harold to respond, and it undermined confidence in the king's ability to protect the south. At the same time, William had to manage his own men. Promised rewards were one thing. A prolonged wait on foreign soil was another. Foraging provided food, and also kept the army active and confident. But it had to be controlled enough that it did not scatter the force into small, vulnerable bands. So William balanced aggression with cohesion. His operational goal was not to roam deep into England at once. It was to establish a secure base, gather intelligence, and force a decision on terms favourable to him. That meant drawing Harold into battle. William's claim to the crown, his papal support if one accepts the Norman account that such support was granted, and his careful messaging were all aimed at presenting the invasion as lawful correction rather than naked piracy. But legitimacy would ultimately be decided by power, and power, in 1066, could be settled in a single day on a battlefield. Intelligence mattered as much as food from Sussex. William could probe the land, learn the roads, identify defensible ground, and listen for reports of English movement. He would also have understood Harold's predicament. The English king had been watching the south for months, then marched north to confront Hardrada, and now, after Stamford Bridge, would be forced to reverse direction again. William did not need to chase Harold. He needed to remain planted, visible and threatening, so that the political weight of invasion pulled Harold toward him. News reached the English court, and earls quickly enough to create crisis, but not quickly enough to prevent the landing. Coastal watchers, local levies, and messengers carried word inland that Norman ships had come ashore and that Sussex was being stripped. For Harold, still in the aftermath of battle in the north, the timing was cruel. His army had fought hard and won, but it was tired and diminished. The longer he delayed, the more William could fortify, forage, and perhaps win support through fear or opportunism. Yet if Harold moved too fast, he risked arriving with exhausted men and incomplete forces, repeating the dangers of Stamford Bridge, only now against a fresh, well-prepared enemy. By the final days of September, the new shape of the war was set. William stood behind rising earthworks on English soil, his supply line running back to the sea, his army fed by the countryside and held together by his command. Harold, far to the north, had learned that the true struggle for the crown had only just begun, and that time again was the most dangerous enemy of all. Harold now faced the cruelest kind of choice a king can face in war: to move quickly and risk arriving weak, or to move slowly and risk losing the country while he gathered strength. The news from Sussex did not merely report a landing. It reported fortifications rising, foraging parties ranging out, and the authority of the crown being tested in the very region where Harold's own family held deep influence. William's presence was not distant. It was immediate, and it was political as much as military. From York and the north, Harold turned south with the core of the army that had won at Stamford Bridge. The speed of the march has become one of the most remarked details of the campaign. Even if later writers exaggerated the pace, the direction of travel was clear. Harold pushed hard. But an army that has just fought a major battle is not a clean instrument. Men were wounded, equipment was damaged or lost, horses were spent. The housecarls, Harold's professional retainers, remained the best fighting force he had, but they too had taken losses. The wider fyrd, the local militia levies, did not move as easily or as reliably over long distances, especially as autumn advanced, and households worried about harvest and winter. Reinforcements were possible in theory, but far harder in practice. England's military strength depended on regional obligations and on the cooperation of powerful earls. Here the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, Edwin and Morcar become central, not because they were present in Sussex, but because they were not. Their forces had been heavily involved in the northern crisis, and after Fulford and Stamford Bridge their capacity, and perhaps their willingness to march again at once, was limited. Some sources imply they withdrew to protect their own regions. Others suggest the shock to Northumbria made immediate movement impossible. Either way, What mattered was the limit of national coordination. England was a kingdom, but it was not a centrally drilled machine. Harold could command, but he could not simply summon a fully fresh national army and expect it to appear on a single road at a single moment. That constraint was sharpened by politics. Harold's kingship, proclaimed in January, had been accepted, but it had not been unchallenged. A foreign invader carrying his own claim, and perhaps, if Norman sources are believed, papal approval, threatened to reopen every doubt about legitimacy. Harold needed to be seen acting as king, defending the land, protecting the church, and responding decisively. Delay could be read as prudence by soldiers, but as weakness by rivals. And in 1066, the crown rested on consent as much as on ceremony. If confidence broke, it could break quickly. As Harold moved south, he likely passed through the old centres of royal administration, where messages, supplies, and men could be gathered, places along the great roads like Lincoln, and then toward the Midlands. Many historians place an important stop in London, where the king could draw on the resources of the city and the surrounding shires, and where messengers could spread the call for the feared to assemble. What Harold knew, and when he knew it, is not perfectly clear, but he would have learned enough. William was concentrated in Sussex, with bases at Pevensey and Hastings, and was provisioning by force. Harold also would have understood what William wanted. An invader who fortifies and forages is inviting a battle, because his position is strongest when the defender attacks under pressure. At this point Harold had options, and they were not all the same kind of risk. He could delay, gathering a larger army, and perhaps waiting for Edwin and Morcar or their detachments to join. He could attempt a blockade of the Norman position, using control of roads and the threat of cutting foraging parties to starve William into retreat. He could order a scorched earth policy in Sussex and neighbouring regions, denying supplies, an ugly strategy, and one that would punish his own subjects first. Or he could seek immediate engagement before William's foothold became a settled occupation with broader support. The debate over what Harold should have done has long divided historians, and the sources do not allow certainty. Some argue that waiting for more forces was the sounder military plan, because it would reduce the strain on an exhausted army and increase the chance of overwhelming the invader. Others note that delay had its own dangers. William was already entrenched, and every day of Norman foraging weakened the king's authority, drained the region, and risked drawing local submission through fear. The essential point is not a modern judgment about the right decision, but the reality that Harold's choices were constrained by time, logistics, and legitimacy all at once. Harold chose to advance. As he approached Sussex, his army drew in additional levies from the south and east, men obliged by duty and drawn by alarm, but these forces varied in readiness. The housecarls remained the hard core, disciplined and heavily armed. The Fyrd added numbers, and with numbers came both strength and unpredictability. Harold could not keep everyone in the field indefinitely. Seasonal obligations pressed on the militia, and the longer an army sat, the more it thinned. So the pressure to bring matters to a decision was not only Harold's political impulse, it was built into the structure of his forces. By mid-October, Harold moved into the area north of Hastings, and took up a position on rising ground near what later tradition would call Senlac Hill. It was a strong defensive choice, a ridge that could force attackers uphill, narrow the front, and let the English line hold firm with shields locked close. Harold's approach suggests he intended to fight on ground that reduced the advantage of Norman cavalry and created a contest of endurance. He was not charging blindly toward the shore. He was positioning to meet the enemy on terms that suited an army built around infantry strength. On the eve of confrontation, the campaign narrowed into a single question. William needed a battle that could break Harold's kingship in one stroke. Harold needed a battle that could break the invasion before it became permanent. Both commanders understood that the next day might decide not just a war, but the shape of England's future. The armies settled into place, each measuring the other across the darkening hours, as Sussex waited for the judgment of the ridge. Morning brought both armies into clearer view, drawn up on the ridge and the slopes below it. Harold's choice of ground had already made a statement. He would not meet William on the open lowlands where cavalry could move freely. He would stand on the high spine of the hill and make the Normans pay for every step. The English army was built for that kind of fight. At its heart were the housecarls, the king's own household troops and the retainers of great men, professionals by the standards of the age. They were well equipped with mail shirts, helmets, and heavy weapons, most famously the two-handed Danish axe that could split shield and limb if it landed cleanly. Around them stood the fyrd, the militia levies called up from the shires. The fyrd was numerous, essential, and uneven. Some men would be well armed, especially those from wealthier districts or with prior service. Others carried lighter spears, axes, and simple protection. But whatever their differences, the English fought as infantry, and the battle plan depended on one thing above all, the shield wall. A shield wall was not a single object, but a collective discipline. Shields overlapped or pressed close, spears angled forward, gaps filled quickly, men braced by the weight and presence of those beside them. On a ridge, it turned the English line into a barrier that was hard to break without causing disorder. Harold's standards and the presence of the king himself in the centre helped anchor that wall psychologically as much as physically. As long as the line held, the English could force the battle into a grinding contest, where individual Norman advantages mattered less. William's army was a different instrument, assembled for invasion and built for combined action. It included infantry, men with spears and swords who could climb and close, but also a significant body of archers, and most crucially, cavalry. Norman horsemen were not the later heavily armoured knights of popular imagination, but they were trained to fight in coordinated groups, to press, withdraw, and press again, and to exploit any opening with speed. William's strength lay in mixing arms, archers to disrupt, infantry to fix the enemy in place, and cavalry to strike where the line weakened. The ground shaped how those strengths could be used. The ridge near Senlac narrowed the effective front. The slope forced attackers to climb under pressure, and the crest gave the defenders better footing and sightlines. Even the surface mattered. Autumn fields could be churned and slick, and a slope under repeated assaults became exhausting. For the Normans, every advance meant a climb into a solid wall of shields. For the English, every moment they held increased the chance that William's attack would break itself. The opening phase began with missiles. Norman archers stepped forward and loosed their first flights. But the elevation worked against them. Arrows shot uphill, lost force, and often struck shields at poor angles. Many likely sailed over the crest or thudded harmlessly into wood and rim. The English had fewer archers of their own, at least in the surviving accounts, and relied instead on staying tight and letting the slope do its work. In these first exchanges, the arrow storm that William hoped would loosen the line did not deliver a quick result. Then came the first assaults uphill. Infantry advanced, and behind or among them cavalry sought purchase on the slope. The attackers had to come on in broken momentum, breath shortening as they climbed, formations stretched by the gradient and by the obstacles of the ground. At the crest they met axes, spears, and the sheer shove of a packed shield wall. For the English, this was the fight they had prepared for. Stand, absorb, and strike downward into men struggling to climb. The first contacts were fierce, but not decisive. The Norman attack gained noise and motion without yet finding a fracture. Command in such a battle depended on visibility and signals more than on detailed control. Harold, fixed at the top, likely directed by the steady presence of the royal standard and by trusted thegns conveying orders along the line. His main decision, once engaged, was less about manoeuvre and more about restraint, keeping men from pursuing too far, closing gaps immediately, and holding the crest as the point of honour and survival. William's command challenge was different. He had to coordinate 3 types of troops across a slope, under pressure, and in the confusion of hand-to-hand fighting. He could not simply issue a single order and expect it to carry cleanly. Control came through messengers, horns, banners, and the example of leaders riding where they were needed. In the sources, William appears repeatedly as a commander who moved to points of danger to steady them, an image that may be partly shaped by later Norman storytelling, but fits the practical demands of the day. An early crisis soon tested that control. At some point in the first hours, one part of the Norman line, often associated with the Breton contingent on one flank, fell into disorder and began to give ground. Retreat on a slope could become a rout in moments, and in medieval battle rumour was almost as deadly as steel. As Normans pulled back, a shout spread that William had been killed. Whether the rumour began from genuine uncertainty, from the chaos of the fighting, or from wishful English voices on the ridge, it threatened to unravel the invasion in an instant. If the Duke was dead, why keep climbing? William acted quickly. Several accounts emphasise that he rode forward, showed himself, and proved he was alive. Some say he lifted his helmet so his face could be recognised. The detail may be polished by retelling, but the underlying truth is plausible. In a battle held together by confidence, the commander's living presence could stitch a line back into shape. The retreat slowed, then stopped. The rumour was mastered, and with it, the first real chance of a sudden Norman collapse. The English, meanwhile, faced their own danger. Success could tempt them into breaking formation. As the Normans wavered, some Englishmen, likely among the less disciplined, feared, surged forward down the slope to strike at enemies in retreat. It was a natural impulse, and sometimes a useful one, but it carried a cost. Men who left the shield wall left gaps behind them, and once downhill they were separated from the protective mass of the line. The ridge that had been a fortress became farther away with every step. In these opening hours, no final turning point had yet arrived. What had emerged instead were the basic truths of the battle. The English position was strong, but it demanded discipline. The Norman army was flexible, but it needed cohesion and confidence to keep climbing into a wall that would not easily break. And over both armies, as the morning wore on, hung the fragile power of morale, how quickly a rumour could wound, and how quickly a leader's presence could heal it. Once the first rush of advantage passed, the battle settled into something harder to see in the grand stories, but decisive in reality: repetition. William did not need a single miraculous breach. He needed time, pressure, and opportunities created by English impatience. The withdrawals on the Norman flank, whether they began as genuine disorder or as controlled movement, revealed a dangerous pattern. Each time some Normans fell back, a portion of the English line loosened. Men streamed downhill to finish what looked like a victory, and downhill the pursuers were suddenly fighting without the ridge beneath their feet, and without the density of the shield wall around them. There, Norman cavalry could turn and strike into scattered groups. Mounted men did not have to smash the whole English army. They only had to punish those who separated themselves, and then ride back before the rest of the shield wall could advance to help. Sources later describe feigned retreats, a tactic associated with Norman flexibility and discipline. It is possible that William, seeing how well pursuit worked for him, began to encourage controlled pullbacks to bait the English. But it is also possible that later writers sharpened messy battlefield moments into a neat plan. Either way, the effect was real. Pursuit became a recurring risk for Harald. Every time the line surged forward, it became thinner at the crest, and every time it thinned, the next Norman assault found slightly more give. Hour after hour, repeated attacks wore down the shield wall, not only through casualties, but through fatigue and disruption. A wall of shields is strongest when men can brace and recover between blows. On Senlac's Ridge, recovery was limited. Mail grew heavy with sweat. Arms tired from holding shields at the same height. Housecarls who had stood firm in the morning had to keep closing small gaps as men fell or drifted out of place. And the longer the fight went on, the more the English reliance on a single formation became a liability. The Fyrd could stand and fight, but it was not trained to endure an entire day of coordinated pressure from archers, infantry and cavalry rotating through waves. As the afternoon wore on, William's combined arms began to bite more effectively. Archery that had been blunted earlier by the slope and angle could be adjusted. Accounts suggest that Norman archers started shooting higher, sending arrows in arcs so they dropped onto the crowded crest rather than striking straight into shield faces. Even if only some volleys landed well, the psychological effect mattered. Men who could once trust their shields now had to fear what might fall behind the rim. Cavalry and infantry kept returning to the climb. Not every assault was a charge in the later Romantic sense. Horses struggled for footing, and riders were vulnerable near the crest. But repeated pressure, timed with missiles and with infantry pushing close, increased the chance that the English line would lose its clean edge. A shield wall does not collapse all at once, it fragments. A few men step forward too far, a few step back without meaning to. A cluster turns to face an immediate threat. And suddenly there are angles in the line, places where an attacker can wedge in, not by strength alone, but because the defenders are no longer presenting one continuous front. By late day, cohesion, more than courage, became the deciding factor. Harold's position at the centre was still the anchor, with the royal standard as the rallying point. But around that centre, the English defence was increasingly a series of hard-fought stands rather than one unbroken barrier. William's army, battered and costly to maintain, nonetheless had one advantage. It could still attempt something new. The English had fewer options than hold. It is in this late, exhausted phase that the most famous moment is placed, the death of King Harold. Here the sources diverge, and the uncertainty matters. The popular image is of an arrow in the eye, drawn in later art and echoed in later accounts. Yet not all contemporary or near-contemporary descriptions agree, and some are silent on the arrow entirely. Other versions describe Harold being cut down in melee, or being struck by multiple wounds as the fighting surged around the standard. It is possible that an arrow wounded him, and that he was finished in close combat. It is also possible that the arrow story was shaped by Norman propaganda, useful as moral symbolism, or simply a misunderstanding amplified over time. What can be said with confidence is simpler and more brutal. At some point near the end of the battle, Harold was killed, and his death removed the central point of English command at the worst possible moment. The immediate effect was not instantaneous surrender, but it was irreversible disintegration. The king's death struck at the logic of the English position. Housecarls could die where they stood, and many likely did, defending the standard as a matter of duty and honour. But without Harold, coordinated restraint became harder. Units and local contingents began to pull away. Some retreated along the ridge line toward the nearby woods, others broke downslope. Norman cavalry, built for pursuit, exploited the movement, cutting into fleeing groups and turning retreat into slaughter in places. Later tradition remembers a deadly episode of pursuit, where Normans themselves suffered losses in a sudden collapse of ground or an ambush at the edge of terrain. Details vary, but the broad pattern fits the warfare of the time. The killing often intensified once a line ceased to be a line. English leaders also fell or vanished from the field. Harold's brothers, Gyrth and Leofwine, are commonly reported among the dead. though details are sparse and sometimes contradictory. What is clear is that the battle removed more than a king. It damaged the leadership class that could have organised immediate resistance. And yet Hastings, for all its decisiveness, was not the same thing as instant control of England. William had won the field and broken Harold's army, but he had not yet taken the kingdom's administrative heart. London still mattered. The English still had powerful earls and a tradition of choosing kings. What Hastings did was clear away the one force that could quickly stop William's next move. The road to the crown was opened not by a single blow, but by the collapse of English cohesion at the end of a long day, and by the death of the man who had held that cohesion together. Hastings had opened the road, but it had not delivered the kingdom. William held a battlefield and a shaken coastline, not yet the machinery of English government. The days after the fight were therefore not a triumphal march so much as a careful consolidation. He stayed close to his line of supply, securing the ports that kept Normandy within reach, and tightening control over the routes that could move men, horses, and food. Dover, battered and vulnerable, submitted after William advanced toward it. There, as elsewhere, he demanded hostages, human guarantees that promises would be kept, and he placed garrisons to hold what he had taken. This was conquest by logistics as much as by shock. William could not afford to be cut off in hostile country, so he anchored himself to the Channel and to the roads leading inland. Some towns negotiated quickly, preferring terms to destruction. Others resisted, and resistance was met with enough force to become a warning. The pattern was deliberate. Pressure, then negotiation, controlled violence, then a settlement that brought money, hostages, and obedience. Meanwhile, the English political world was reeling into motion without the king who had held it together. In London and beyond, the question was not merely whether to fight on, but who had the right to command. The surviving great men looked for a figure around whom legitimacy might gather. Harold's immediate family had suffered heavily at Hastings, and the Witan, the council of leading nobles and churchmen, still mattered as the body that could recognise a king. Attention turned to Edgar Atheling, young and untested, but crucially of the old royal line. He was proclaimed king by some in London, more a symbol of continuity than a leader capable of directing war. The Earls Edwin and Morcar, powerful brothers from Mercia and Northumbria, were central to this moment. They had not been at Hastings, and their ability to raise men gave them weight. Yet they hesitated. Their past relationship with Harold had been complicated, and now their interests did not automatically align with a boy king in London. They could support Edgar, bargain with William, or wait to see which way the wind truly blew. That uncertainty, inside the English elite, not just among frightened towns, was one of William's greatest advantages. William moved accordingly, avoiding the most dangerous mistake an invader could make, charging straight at London and hoping fear would do the rest. London was large, defended, and positioned behind the River Thames, with bridges and fortified approaches that could punish a rash assault. Instead, William applied pressure in a widening circle. After securing Dover and the southeast, he advanced through Kent and toward the Thames corridor, taking towns whose submission tightened the noose. Canterbury, the senior archbishopric of England, was an especially important prize in symbolic terms, even if the exact details of its submission are not fully clear in the sources. Step by step, William aimed to make London feel surrounded, not stormed. When Norman forces probed nearer the capital, they met resistance. A notable clash took place at Southwark across the river from London, where fighting and fire, whether accidental, deliberate, or simply the result of brutal street combat, left destruction that carried a message. It was not necessary to take the city by assault if the approaches could be made costly and unstable. William then chose a strategic detour. He moved west, crossing the Thames where it was less strongly held at Wallingford. That crossing mattered. The Thames was not just a river, it was a highway of power. Control along it meant control of movement, trade, and the ability to threaten London from multiple directions. At Wallingford, a key submission followed. The powerful churchman Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury in office, though burdened by questions of legitimacy, came to meet William and offered terms. Whether Stigand acted from calculation, fear, or both, his submission signalled to other leaders that bargaining was possible, and that the moral and administrative world of England was beginning to tilt toward the new power. With the Thames crossing secured and towns along the route giving hostages, William advanced toward London again, now from a position designed to break resolve without a prolonged siege. The English leaders in the city faced hard truths. The field army had been destroyed. Regional unity was uncertain. And William had the ability to devastate the surrounding countryside while denying them a decisive battle. Edgar Atheling's prominence faded as quickly as it had risen. Edwin and Morcar, along with other leading men, chose submission. It was not necessarily admiration. It was a calculation about survival, property, and the possibility of keeping some authority under a new king. On Christmas Day, 1066. William was crowned at Westminster, in the newly built abbey associated with Edward the Confessor. The setting mattered. Westminster tied William to the memory and sanctity of the last king whose reign had been widely accepted. The ritual oaths, anointing, and acclamation was designed to translate conquest into lawful rule. Yet the atmosphere was tense. When the congregation shouted assent in the old custom, Norman guards outside, not understanding the language and fearing a rising, reacted violently. In the confusion, fire broke out in nearby buildings. Inside the church, the ceremony continued. But the moment captured the reality beneath the symbolism. A kingdom had not simply welcomed a new monarch, it had been forced into one. With the crown placed, William began the early distribution of rewards that would bind his followers to English soil. Lands, offices, and promises were granted, and Norman garrisons held key points. The first castles, timber fortifications thrown up quickly, began to appear as instruments of control. The conquest, in other words, did not end with the coronation. It only changed shape. William had won the crown, but now he had to make it stay on his head, in a country that had not yet finished deciding what it was willing to endure. The months after the coronation proved that submission in a moment of shock was not the same as acceptance. Resistance continued because England was not a single, neatly unified political community. Loyalties were regional and personal, tied to earls, local leaders, and old habits of rule. Many feared dispossession as Norman grants spread, fear that proved well-founded as estates changed hands. And beyond England, William's enemies watched for weakness. Foreign encouragement mattered because it offered rebels something England now lacked: the prospect of outside force arriving at the right time. Early uprisings flared where William's hold was thinnest. In 1067, while William travelled back to Normandy to display his new kingship and manage his duchy, the limits of conquest showed. Rebellions broke out in the west and along the Welsh border, and in the southwest. Exeter resisted and was brought to terms after a hard campaign. It was a warning that large towns could still test the new regime, and that William would answer with siege and the planting of a permanent garrison. In the borderlands, where power had long been contested, Norman lords began carving out marcher strongholds, and violence mixed quickly with settlement. The most dangerous trouble, however, gathered in the north. Northumbria had a tradition of distance from southern rule and a fierce sense of its own leadership. In 1068, Edwin and Morcar, earlier submitters, shifted again, drawn into revolt as it became clearer that William's government would not simply preserve their authority. William marched rapidly, building and garrisoning as he went, and forced a new round of submissions. At York he established castles, not as symbols but as mechanisms, fortified points from which small professional garrisons could dominate a large, resentful region. Yet the north remained unstable. In 1269 it erupted. The Northumbrian Earl Robert de Comines was killed at Durham in an uprising that showed how exposed Norman officials could be when isolated. A new English leader, Edgar Atheling, reappeared as a rallying figure, joined by disaffected nobles and local forces. And then came the development William most feared, a Danish fleet. Denmark mattered because it was both plausible and legitimate in English eyes. The Danish king, Sweyn II, could claim family connections to earlier rulers of England and could present intervention as restoration rather than invasion. For English rebels, Danish ships meant mobility, experienced warriors, and the chance to break the grip of Norman garrisons. For William, Danish involvement turned rebellion from an internal security problem into an international threat. If Danes could seize a major port or hold York long enough, Normandy itself might be pulled into a wider war. In late 1069 the Danes arrived in force and moved into the Humber, joining English rebels. York fell, and the Norman castles there were taken and burned. Many of their defenders were killed. For a brief moment it looked like the conquest might unravel in the very region where William's authority was newest. William answered with speed and severity. He marched north in winter conditions, bought off the Danes when he could, fought when he had to, and re-established the castles. But he also chose a deeper response, one intended not merely to win back towns, but to make future rebellion harder to sustain. This was the harrying of the north, carried out mainly in 1069 and 1070. Its aim was strategic, to deny rebels food, shelter, and the ability to keep armies in the field and to punish communities that supported repeated revolts. The methods described by chroniclers are consistent with that aim, and with the brutality of medieval war. Systematic burning of villages, destruction of crops and stores, slaughter of livestock, and the killing of those who resisted. The devastation drove people from their homes and contributed to famine and disease. Even allowing for exaggeration in hostile accounts, historians broadly agree the impact was severe and that it left deep scars across parts of Yorkshire and beyond. The numbers are contested. Some medieval writers speak in vast totals of dead, figures that many modern historians treat cautiously, both because medieval statistics are often rhetorical and because the affected area, while extensive, was not the whole north in an even sweep. What is not seriously disputed is the underlying reality. William's campaign created widespread ruin and hunger, and it was remembered even by later generations living under Norman rule as an extreme act of retribution and control. Repression alone, though, did not hold a kingdom for long. It had to be followed by a structure that made control routine. That structure was a network of castles, most commonly motte and bailey fortifications at first, thrown up quickly from earth and timber. A motte, a raised mound crowned with a tower. A bailey, a fenced enclosure below. Together they formed a compact military base that could be built fast and defended by a relatively small garrison. Castles anchored roads, river crossings, and towns. They stored supplies, housed cavalry, and served as places to imprison hostages and enforce demands. Over time, the combination changed the odds. The harrying and other punitive campaigns reduced the capacity to rebel by stripping regions of resources and leadership. Castles then ensured that any new uprising would face hard points of resistance, able to hold out until relief arrived. Each revolt met not just a royal army, but a landscape increasingly fitted with Norman strongholds and loyal garrisons. By the early 1070s, rebellion still appeared most dramatically in the fenlands around Ely, where Hereward and others used the marshes for defence. But the pattern was shifting. Revolt became more localised, more difficult to coordinate, and easier to isolate. Conquest was turning into governance, not gentler, but more secure. And as England's old elite learned what submission truly meant, William's rule began to rely less on negotiation and more on a new permanent reality: land redistributed, power fortified, and resistance, step by step, deprived of the means to survive. The new permanent reality was built on land. In the years after Hastings, and especially after the great rebellions were broken, William and his followers treated England less as a prize to be shared casually and more as a system to be rewired. The most visible change was at the top, the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. At first, some English lords kept their estates by submitting, and a few continued to serve in limited roles. But each uprising, each suspected disloyalty, and each confiscation narrowed the space for compromise. By the end of William's reign, the great earldoms and most major estates had passed into Norman hands. The old aristocracy was not simply taxed or supervised, it was displaced. In its place stood a new layer of landholders, tenants-in-chief, men who held directly from the king and owed him military service and loyalty. Their lands were often scattered across counties rather than concentrated in a single region, a pattern that reduced the chance that any one magnate could become an independent local king. England's political map was still divided into shires, but the ownership within those shires had been reallocated with careful intent. Yet Norman rule did not wipe away Anglo-Saxon government. William kept much of the existing machinery because it worked. Shires remained the basic units of administration. Sheriffs continued to collect royal revenues and enforce order, though now many sheriffs were Normans, and the office grew more closely tied to the king's interests. The writ, short, authoritative orders issued in the king's name, continued as a practical instrument of rule. Royal justice still leaned on older courts and local assemblies, and many customary laws remained in force. Continuity and conquest ran together. The structure stayed recognizable, while the people directing it and the assumptions behind it changed. Alongside older practices came new Norman habits. More castles, more mounted warriors as a political force, and a tightening of lordship in a way that made landholding and service feel more sharply defined. Language marked the new hierarchy. At the royal court and among the great lords, Norman French became the language of power, law, and fashionable life, while Latin remained the language of formal record and the church. English did not vanish. It remained the language of most people and most daily speech. But the split mattered. Over generations it reshaped English itself, feeding it a tide of French vocabulary, especially in law, government, warfare, and elite culture, until the language that re-emerged in later centuries carried the conquest in its grammar and word choices. The church was also remade, and William treated it as central to stable rule. In 1070, after the Northern Crisis and the need for firmer control, leading English bishops and abbots were removed and replaced with men connected to the wider reform movement on the continent. Lanfranc, an Italian scholar and abbot from Normandy, became Archbishop of Canterbury and helped organize a program of reform, enforcing clerical discipline, strengthening ecclesiastical courts, and bringing English practice more closely into line with continental standards. Cathedrals and monasteries were reorganized. Some sees were moved from small towns to more prominent urban centres. Reform had genuine religious aims, but it also served governance. A church led by William's appointees could provide educated administrators, legitimize royal authority, and link England more tightly to networks of learning and influence beyond the Channel. Castles, already spreading during the years of rebellion, became part of ordinary administration. They were not only military shelters, they were instruments of authority. A castle's garrison could enforce a lord's claims, protect stored revenues, and intimidate opponents without the king needing to be physically present. As timber forts were replaced by stone in key places, they signalled permanence. Around many castles, settlement patterns shifted. Markets, workshops, and new streets grew near the protection and the pressure of the fortification. Some towns benefited from new trade and security. Others carried the burden of forced labour, requisitioned supplies, and the constant reminder that power now sat behind walls. The clearest measure of this new order came late in William's reign, when the kingdom was, in effect, audited in 1085, faced with external threats and the need to know precisely what resources England could provide. William ordered the survey that became the Domesday Book. It was unprecedented in scale and method. Royal commissioners travelled through the shires using sworn testimony from juries made up of local men, often drawn from both Norman and English communities, to answer a set of standardized questions. What land was held and by whom? How much was it worth? How many plough teams, villagers, smallholders, slaves and livestock did it contain? What had it been worth in King Edward's day? What was it worth now? And what could it be worth if fully exploited? The survey recorded not just ownership, but productive capacity, as if England were being translated into numbers and obligations. Domesday did not capture everything. Some regions were recorded more fully than others, and its categories reflect the concerns of power more than the texture of lived experience. But that is precisely why it mattered. It created a reference point for taxation and for disputes over rights. It told the king with startling clarity who held what from him, and what could be demanded in return. In a world where memory and custom often decided ownership, written record became a weapon. For ordinary people, the conquest was felt less in royal ceremonies than in the steady weight of obligations. New lords brought new expectations, tighter control over dues, labour services, and payments tied to land. Taxes could rise sharply in difficult years, and the sheriff's visit was rarely welcome. Some communities adapted, negotiating with new masters, continuing to farm the same fields, worship in the same churches, and attend the same local courts, only now under a different language of authority. Others suffered displacement, especially where lands were reorganized or where castles and new estates disrupted older patterns. By the time Domesday's inquiries were compiled, England had not become a different country overnight, but it had become a different kingdom. The old elite had been largely replaced, the church reoriented, the landscape fortified, and the land itself measured and catalogued. The conquest had moved beyond victory and punishment. It had become an enduring system, one that would shape English power, English society, and even English words for centuries to come. Domesday, with its hard answers and harder implications, belonged to the last phase of William's rule, the moment when conquest settled into routine government. Yet even then, the king's hold on his new kingdom was never effortless, because he was not only King of England, he remained Duke of Normandy, and the channel that linked his lands also divided his attention. The later reign was shaped by pressures that did not fade with victory, rebellions that flared when the crown seemed distant, the constant work of rewarding followers without letting any one lord grow too secure, and the strain of commanding loyalty across two political worlds. England was richer in revenue than Normandy, and it had to finance garrisons, castles, and the king's movements. Taxes could be heavy, and the machinery that collected them, sheriffs, writs, audits like Domesday, grew more central because money was as decisive as knights. At the same time, William's own family politics added another fault line. His sons were adults with ambitions, and their rivalries intersected with baronial interests on both sides of the Channel, creating a recurring problem: how to keep an empire together when inheritance, by custom, tended to divide it. William's end came in 1087, not in England, but in Normandy, during a campaign sparked by conflict with the French crown. He was injured. Later chroniclers describe a fatal internal wound, and he died at Rouen. The settlement he left behind revealed the true nature of what he had built. England went to his second surviving son William Rufus, while Normandy went to his eldest, Robert Curthose. It was not a single seamless state, but a personal union held together by one man's authority. Once that authority was gone, the edges showed. The cross-channel aristocracy now had to navigate divided loyalties, and the struggle over whether England and Normandy should be reunited would echo for generations. Still, the most durable outcomes did not depend on William's presence. Landholding had been transformed, and the new ruling class did not vanish with the conqueror's death. Castles, estates, and ties of lordship anchored Norman power in the countryside. Royal administration, already formidable in late Anglo-Saxon England, was sharpened by conquest into a more penetrative system of record, taxation, and enforceable claims. Feudal relationships, service owed for land defined and tracked, became more explicit, and the English Church remained closely aligned with continental reform and with the Crown's authority. Over time, even identity changed. The language of rulers and law was reshaped. English absorbed French vocabulary and emerged altered, carrying the conquest in everyday speech. By the 12th century, the descendants of conquerors and conquered were no longer simply Normans and English, but a blended elite and a transformed kingdom. That is why 10,066 was not only a battle and a coronation. It redirected land, power, institutions, and culture at once, turning a contested succession into a permanent reordering of England's place in Europe and of what it meant to rule and to belong within the English realm.